Hi, young adults. Today we're going to be focusing on Module 11, specifically talking about the limbic system. So if you have your course packet, it should be page 8 in your course packet. Take a second, make sure your Module 11 notes are out next to you. Get some maybe colored pencils or markers or crayons next to you because we're going to use some color to go through the limbic system diagrams. If you need to pause the video to get yourself situated, now would be the time. Okay, I've got my page out. In a previous two videos, we did these two diagrams, so we're going to move down to this bottom diagram here together. And the focus today, like I mentioned, is going to be the limbic system. So I'm just going to label this diagram limbic system. Okay? I'll make it very clear. So when we're talking about the limbic system, we're talking about this, your book calls it like a donut-shaped neural system that takes place, it's almost an intermediary between the older structures of the brain and your cerebral cortex. So in terms of evolution, right, the thing that developed first in terms of evolution is going to be like the older structures of the brain that we talked about when we did these two diagrams together. So we're talking about things that enable basic life functioning, right? Heartbeat, breathing, coordinating your movements, your level of alertness, that was all stuff like your medulla, your reticular formation, your cerebellum, like all the parts of the brainstem. So those are things that enable basic life survival. Now we're moving into like the next piece in terms of evolution. That's the limbic system. And the limbic system is specifically linked to emotions. I'm just going to put linked to emotion. Okay. And then the last system to evolve essentially is your cerebral cortex, right? That's where your upper level cognitive thinking is occurring. So in the next video, we'll get to and talk about the cerebral cortex. But for today, we're going to focus on the limbic system. Okay, there are three parts of the limbic system. So I'm just going to put a 1, 2, 3 at the bottom. And this is where we're going to take some notes about the three different parts of the limbic system. Okay, so let's talk about the first part. Okay, I'm going to highlight it in green. It's kind of a little difficult to see, but it's this piece right there. There's actually two of them. There'd be one on the other side if we open the other side of the brain for you to see. And so what I just labeled there is the amygdala. Has an interesting spelling, right? The amygdala. And the amygdala is it helps control emotion, specifically fear and aggression. Helps control emotion, specifically fear and aggression. Okay, as your book point out to you, there are two amygdalas, and then they're basically kind of like at the end of the hippocampus, essentially. And I'll show you what the hippocampus is in a second. But this idea right here, this is amygdala. There's two of them. They're about the size of a lima bean, and they once again help control emotions such as fear and aggression. Is this the only place that your emotions of fear and aggression are regulated? No, because your cerebral cortex is going to come into play. But amygdala specifically is fear and aggression. My trick for remembering what the amygdala does is if you look at the root, it looks like Amy. So I always say it's like Amy is angry, right? Amygdala. Amy is angry, and so she's a lot of aggression and a lot of fear. Okay. So once again, amygdala helps process this idea of fear and emotion, rage, perception of emotions, and processing of emotional memories. That's all part of the amygdala. Okay. The second one that we will cover, I guess I will write it in green here because it's pointing to the amygdala here to make sure we can, amygdala, that we can clearly see that it was the green one. Okay. The second part that I would like to talk about, I will do it in orange, and I will write it down here too. It's going to be the hippocampus. Hopefully you can read that okay. I know I'm working on yellow paper here. Okay, so the hippocampus. And if you look, the hippocampus, it basically curves around. And towards the base is where you're going to see the amygdala. Okay? And it would split the other direction towards the other amygdala too, because remember there's two amygdalas. So when we look at the hippocampus, this is going to be active in the formation of new memories, of new conscious memories. And I'll label it right here. This line's showing you your hippocampus again. Okay. So your hippocampus processing new conscious memories. If you were to injure your hippocampus, right? If you were in some type of accident or like was damaged during surgery, I guess which would qualify as an accident. If you damage this, you would be unable to process new memories of facts and events, right? Like anything that happened after it was damaged, you wouldn't be able to process that information and therefore you wouldn't be able to store new memories. Okay. So hippocampus is helps in the processing of new memories. Now you should remember, right? The limbic system is linked to emotion. And the point I'm trying to make here is when you think of memories, right? Like if I was to ask you to recall like your favorite childhood memory, as you recall that memory, most often you also start to recall the feeling that you had when that memory was being created, right? So I want to be very clear that your limbic system, right, linked to emotion, formation of new memories, those things go hand in hand, right? Normally when you're forming a new memory, you're also, the memory itself isn't just of the actions, but how you feel when the actions or whatever the memory is was occurring, right? So your hippocampus, formation of new conscious memories. And then the third one that we need to talk about, which is the big one, I'm going to call it the big one. I'll use this like maroon color, is your hypothalamus. Okay. Hypo means below. So your hypothalamus is going to be just below your thalamus. So I'm going to highlight it kind of right here. Okay. And I'll label it over here, your hypothalamus. Once again, hypo means below, so it should be below your thalamus. I'll show you where your thalamus is in a second on the video. Okay, so when we're talking about the hypothalamus, it has a lot of functions. Okay, it's just below the thalamus. This right here is the thalamus. I'll shade it in a second for you in a different color. And it performs a lot of bodily maintenance duties. So I'm going to put involved in bodily maintenance activities. Okay. And so we're going to go through what some of those things are right now. A lot of times you might hear people talking about with the hypothalamus, the 4 or 5 F's. And so I'll go through what those are right now. So the 4 or 5 F's, I'll just list them right over here. The first one is fight or flight. So those are 2 technically, fight or flight. And where that comes in is the endocrine system, with your releasing of different hormones in the body. And it also has to do with your parasympathetic and sympathetic system. So it has to do with fight or flight. It also has to do with feeding. So there's your third F. So feeding, so we're talking about like hunger and thirst. Hunger and thirst. So that was your third F. I'm going to put Fahrenheit. Ooh, I'm going to misspell that. I should have looked up how to spell it. I guess I could just write furnace because some people remember furnace, but it's F-A. Ooh, Fahrenheit. I spelled it wrong. Can I just put temperature? Don't laugh at me. You can ridicule this video when we meet in person, okay? So it's temperature. So if you want, some people call it furnace as the F. I was going to write Fahrenheit, except I don't know how to spell Fahrenheit currently, which is unfortunate as I'm making a video. And then the last F is going to be fornicate, which is sexual activity. Fornicate. There we go. So it's like sexual impulses. Okay. So there are your 5 F's essentially. Okay. So you got fight or flight, which has to do with like endocrine system and it controls pituitary gland. You got feeding, you got furnace or Fahrenheit that I don't know how to spell, and you got fornicate, which is your sexual activity. So the hypothalamus has a lot of different functions, okay? And so when we talk about feeding, we're talking about hunger and thirst. Your book talked to you about a study that was done with different animals, specifically rats. But when you're talking about this feeding portion of the hypothalamus, if you put an electrode in different parts of the hypothalamus, it's gonna stimulate the hypothalamus to behave in different ways. Okay, So, like if you stimulate one part of the hypothalamus, the part that tells you that you're full, if you stimulate that, a person would literally starve to death, right? If you stimulate a different part of the hypothalamus that says that you're always hungry, then someone would literally eat themselves to death, right? There's actually a disorder, and I've had a student at Highland Park who's actually had this disorder, but it's called Prader-Willi syndrome, and it's when a student's hypothalamus, the part that says that you're full, never sends that message. And so like this student is ravenously hungry 24/7, right? And so it's because her hypothalamus is not acting properly, right? And so maybe some of you have heard of Prader-Willi syndrome before, but it has to do with her hypothalamus telling you, like if you have the syndrome, that you're always hungry, ravenously hungry. Even if you just ate, 3 sandwiches, you're still ravenously hungry. Nothing in your body is telling you that you're full. Okay. So in addition to the 5 F's, I also want to make sure that you are aware that the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. So it controls the pituitary. Okay. It controls the pituitary gland. Now that makes really good sense because the pituitary gland is actually right below the hypothalamus. So this right here, it's kind of hanging there. I'm going to draw a line this way. That is your pituitary gland. Okay. Now, the hypothalamus controls your pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is the master gland of the endocrine system, which is one of the systems that regulates your body, right? So when we talk about the master gland, the pituitary gland, it controls your growth hormones, yes, but it also controls hormones that then send messages to all the rest of your glands, right? Your thyroid, your parathyroid, your pancreas, your adrenal glands, like all those things are controlled by the pituitary gland. So they call it the master gland, but the master gland has a master, and that's the hypothalamus, right? So the hypothalamus is part of your nervous system, right? And I went over this before in a different video. It's part of your nervous system. And the way that your nervous system interacts with your endocrine system is through the pituitary gland, right? So these two things have to talk with each other, okay? So the hypothalamus, once again, controls food, right? Hunger and thirst, your body temperature, and sexual activity. And we'll talk more about this. We're going to do a chapter on motivation. And when we talk about motivation, we'll talk about like sexual motivation. And we'll also talk about hunger motivation, like what are factors that drive you to eat or not eat. And we'll talk about the hypothalamus again. Okay. So those are kind of the systems that we need to look through. Okay. In terms of the limbic system. So these are the 3 parts when we talk about the limbic system that you should make sure that you're aware of. Okay. I'll put that in marker so it all matches. Okay. Let's do a little quick review though of the older structures of the brain, right? Quick little review. So this is, at the base right here, this would be your spinal cord thickening, right? As it goes up, kind of like right behind the formation of your skull. So that's your spinal cord thickening. If you think about like this very first kind of bump out, if you will, right here, it's hard to see because I used a yellow marker. But this bump out right here, this would be like your medulla, which controls heartbeat and breathing, right? The next kind of bump out before right here, I'll label that as your pons, which we talked about. Your pons helps coordinate movement. It's active when you're dreaming, okay? And then at the top of the brainstem, you have your thalamus. And so I will use... let's go with purple. This is your thalamus right here. Okay, it's kind of like the ball that sits on top of the brainstem. And I'll just draw an arrow out. There's thalamus. Okay. Your thalamus is your sensory switchboard. So like incoming neurons that have to do with information, that have information from your senses, are going to come up your spinal cord through the brainstem to your thalamus, and the thalamus sends it to the cerebral cortex where it needs to get processed. Okay. So that was our little review. We went over the limbic system, and then we did a little bit of a review of parts of the older structures of the brain. Hope you enjoyed the video.